are the Brady girls. We are the Brady girls. We know our manners. We spend our time.
I grew up in northwest London, actually, in near Swiss Cottage, and I have a sister, an older sister and an older brother. My brother lives in Australia. My sister lives on the in Herefordshire on the borders with Wales. And we all speak very often and get on very well, but don't live near each other. My parents, who both lived to a ripe old age, my father was 99, that's Yogi, and my mother lived till she was 91. And they were both refugees from Germany, and they got married in Germany in 1938, and then my brother was born in December 38, and they managed to escape from Nazi Germany, or the Nazi regime in Germany, in April 1939. Really the very sort of last people to get out safely. Unfortunately, my mother's family didn't get out, and she lost a brother and parents both in the camps, but didn't know exactly what had happened to them till much later. But it did affect her all her life. Whereas my father had lost his parents his mother when he was 6, his father when he was 11, and he was just a very rebellious, strong, independent boy and man. Got into lots of trouble as a kid, because if he thought something was right, he would do it, and if it was wrong, he would think about it and then decide whether he'd do it or not. A very, very strong character, very funny, lots of humour, and a natural leader of people. And already in Germany, he got him very involved with the Jewish youth movement, because everything was separated and you weren't allowed to mix. And that was because of his love of sport. He was a very gifted sports person, an athlete particularly, and also a swimmer. And later was part of the squad training for the 1936 Olympics. And again, the Jewish squad had to train in separately, and they were, I say, an inferior squad as far as their sports performance was concerned. They were sort of probably national standard as opposed to international standard, and that was because, very calculatedly, Hitler thought, well, if I have got to have Jews in the Olympic Games, they're not going to be winners. And he was part of this squad, and he also trained other young people in athletics, and was very active. And that they then couldn't compete was something that affected him really throughout his life, and the idea that Jewish people were considered inferior. And he already started writing in the 1930s and those times about sporting achievements of Jewish people, particularly in the Olympic Games, and he carried on with this all through his life. And later, when he was in his 80s, published a paper which later got him his doctorate, and a book which was about the history of the Olympic Games, but really comparing how minorities, and particularly Jewish people, how their achievements compared, and actually sort of proving the point that it really made no difference who you were. You were either gifted and had opportunities and achieved and did really well, regardless of race or religion. It made, absolutely no difference. And he was already a youth leader in Germany, so that when they finally came to Britain, it wasn't surprising that he was involved with both sport and taught PE and art. And then in the evening was involved with youth work, and came to Brady first of all as a sports coach in 1948. Really, they'd arrived not that long after the war, and then became a youth club leader full time at Brady in 1951. Yogi would spend most of his weekends, as well as his evenings, at Brady, and the weekends, because he would take the boys, as it was then, to skeet for the weekend. And then occasionally there were mixed weekends too. But most of the ones he was involved in with boys were from the boys' club, because the clubs at that point were separate when I was younger. And then he was running, who had the most amazing camps with 200 or so kids. And he was supported by volunteers who all, when I say, were trained and encouraged and coached by him, and worked with the boys in the club and then helped take them away. And the organisation for this camp, I mean, I used to think it was phenomenal, absolutely enormous, under canvas. So he'd have an advance party and they would go up with some older boys and himself and a couple of other adults, and they would set it all up and put the tents up and the marquees up and a cookhouse and so on, and then everyone would arrive and they'd be allocated, they'd be in groups for the different tents, and they would, it was a very, very active, as I say, it was just boys at first at camp. Lots of sporting activities, but also they used to put on shows and so on, evening activities and so on, and it was just brilliant. And it was very, very cheap for the kids. And those who couldn't pay didn't pay, but nobody knew who did and who didn't. There were also holidays abroad that he'd started, and those were, I think they were always mixed, both boys and girls, from what I can remember, mainly to Switzerland, because he was a great mountaineer, walker, loved the outdoors, and he wanted to offer the kids experiences that they probably wouldn't have. Because if they went abroad, they'd have gone to a seaside resort on a package holiday, and hardly have experienced, I know this is a big generalisation, but that's how it felt at that time, they wouldn't have experienced the actual environment as much or the cultural activities as much. And he thought it was very important, both in the club and when we went away. And the holidays abroad would be about 40 youngsters, they all had to be over 15 or 16, I can't remember quite, to go on the holidays. And then he'd have maybe 4 other adults who would help take the holidays. And at some point, some people didn't want mountain holidays, and there was a great demand for holidays abroad. So a second holiday was set up, which would very often go to Italy and the Italian lakes, to Lake Como, to Menaggio, and other places. And they were sometimes led by other volunteers, and they were taken, and they were much more relaxing holidays. But I mainly went on the holidays. I think all the ones I went were the ones which my father led. And as I was saying, the question really was, how did I get involved with the club? Well, if I wanted to see my father and actually spend time with him, I was just attracted to going to the club. And it was particularly the camps and the holidays abroad, when he encouraged us my sister and myself, in fact, all the family, we all went at different times. My brother went, although he was quite a lot older than me. And then my mother and Monica and I would also go to camp together. I don't remember her coming on any of the holidays abroad. I think she went on one that I went on. And then after that, I was that much older, and Monica and I would go with the girls and become part of the girls' club. And I actually joined the girls' club when I was about 14. And the main thing that attracted me then to join and go during the week was netball, because I was a keen sports person, young girl, absolute tomboy, and we did netball on a Thursday evening. But it was a long journey, and with school the next day, by the time I got back, it was pretty late, so I wouldn't go more than once a week. And I also swam for the club in local galas, and just got very involved through sport and developed very separate friendships and friendship groups from the friends I had from school and Northwest London. In fact, at one point early on, I had sort of 2 different social lives. But in the end, my close relationships were mainly with Brady boys and girls, and developed really good friendships. and many of those friendships I still have today. I went to the club first as a child with my father for skeet weekends when I was probably, I think, 9 or 10, and certainly went to camps when I was that young. But I actually joined the club when I was 14, and that was different because then I was far more independent of Yogi. I was there as a member with my friends, and it was yes, he was the leader, he was the club leader, but it wasn't as the role as my father at all, which was very, very different. And then at that time, when I joined, I was certainly under 15, and it was just the girls things. The boys had just moved into the new building at Hanbury Street. They will have moved in 1960, and I was already getting involved with netball then. But all the girls, there were 2 twin clubs. It was not a mixed club. And the way that operated was that the girls' activities were on the first floor and the boys' activities on the second floor, apart from sports or things that are in the hall. And the reason I think that Yogi felt it was important to move over and develop twin clubs was because the boys' club had such a history and was so dominant, and the boys were so dominant, and Yogi was dominant, and it was so big and loud. I think he had a natural fear that that would change things for the girls in a way that they might not actually initially or long-term choose. So the idea was that they had separate activities and that in the twin clubs, but then at 9:30, after activities and after we had an assembly when we all got together for announcements, and also said a Jewish prayer that's known by everybody, the Shema. After that, which just went on for about 10 minutes, then at 9:30 it would be time for the social, which was when the boys and girls got together. But we also always got together in the canteen, which was the hub of the club. It was a big social area where we sat around the tables, particularly after activities and during when the social was on, the dance, and that's when we'd sit and chat. But you weren't allowed to sit in the canteen when it was activity time. You were meant to be at your activities. And at the time we thought, it's a bit of a drag having to go to an activity, but later on we realised that we all got so much out of them. There was such a range. It wasn't all sport at all. There was a big music aspect to the club, and drama was very big, and also discussion groups, and there was a whole cultural side that Yogi felt was really important and was part of the ethos of both twin clubs as well as when the clubs came together. And my involvement was mainly by the skeet weekends, which I just loved, and the holidays abroad. But with the skeet weekends, I enjoyed the girls' weekends just as much as later on the mixed weekends. And I've got many, many visual memories of particular times and walks and games and shows that we would put on. And I think it was at the girls' weekends that I really developed the friendships that I have for life. It was so much fun. We became very confident. I remember leading, because I knew the country area better than most who were just going for the first or second time, and I'd been going there since I was a younger child. And I'd lead the walks and cross-country, and they were amazed at all these footpaths and how things linked up and just how much fun we had. I've got big, strong memories also of the many shows that we put on and awards nights that the club had. But it was more as a spectator than experiencing. I wasn't in the shows, I didn't perform, but they were great fun to see, and I remember them all. But the holidays abroad and camps were very important parts of my life, and I remember talking with my school friends about it, and they were absolutely envious because none of them, girls' grammar school in North West London, first of all, they knew very few boys, and if they did, it was totally over the top and going mad, and rather than having real friendships. And they were envious at the opportunities and the fun I had and the travel that I got, and how often I left London for weekends away. And I actually invited different friends who came down with me sometimes to the club because they just thought it must sounded great. I went round with a crowd of friends, as I'd mentioned, at Brady, and one of them was Eric, who later on, in fact, when I was at college, we started going out together and later married, and still stayed very involved with the club in the early years of our marriage, because we got married in 1969. We took holidays abroad together. We took a group to Yugoslavia, and then we took another group to Italy. And both of those the holidays, we had so much fun, and so did the kids. And those are very significant holidays in my life as an adult as well. The whole experience of Brady has influenced me so much, positively. There were clubs in North London, and there were one or two Jewish clubs. Not that I was a practising Jewish person particularly, I certainly wasn't religious, but youth clubs were often built around churches and synagogues, because it was the idea of developing and promoting that community and a sense of belonging, and that gave you an opportunity. And a lot of the money to run the club was donations, and that came through either your church or synagogue or whatever it was. But the local authorities were getting more and more involved, and although and recognising the strength and importance of youth clubs. So for my friends, when I was at school, and I was at school until 1964, they were very envious because there were some small clubs, but no clubs offered the range of activities, the holidays and so on that Brady did. In the East End, there were one or two other clubs also that similar to Brady, maybe not as strong, I would say, but similar. But certainly in North London, nothing compared with it. But that changed, because in the 60s, there was more and more recognition of the contribution that these youth clubs were making around the country. Youth centres were set up, which are different from youth clubs because they are to go and do activities, whereas a youth club is more about the community and belonging, and you do activities and you go away. But the youth centres, right, you go to the youth centre to do football, boxing, sport, drama, whatever it is. And they were run, as I say, by local authorities, but they soon realised that you needed qualified, experienced leaders. Leicester College was set up and did a one-year youth leadership training course, and some of the old Brady boys went to Leicester. And then few years later, West Hill College, which was a college of education which trained teachers, set up a whole youth work course, and that was in Birmingham, and that was a 2-year course. And in fact, later they achieved parity with teachers, so the qualification as a teacher entitled you to also do youth work, and for youth leaders also, I don't know whether they could actually teach, I'm not sure. But they tried to raise the status of the qualification of the youth leaders, and it made a great difference to youth work in this country, and it began to flourish. So youth officers were appointed by the local authorities throughout the country, who were responsible for all coordinating whatever youth activities were going on outside schools. So there were youth centres and clubs and lots of alternative, small, different initiatives. There was one in Islington, I remember particularly, for young people who were not school attenders, but it was done through social activities, which was pretty good. And then the tragedies started to happen, which was different governments cut spending. And slowly we saw youth officers went, youth centres went, and this has got worse and worse over the years, and there is very little youth provision today. Just wonder whether there's a link between that and young people's crime, got no idea, but certainly young people's boredom and a lack of opportunity. When you leave school, what do you do? Where do you go? And I think there's just beginning to be a bit of an awakening that actually things are needed. But the youth work, as far as I understand it, youth work provision today is mainly geared about provision for youngsters who are known to have gone off the rails or be at risk. And so there are boxing clubs and other activity clubs, maybe football, run by not necessarily qualified in any way leaders, but massively keen, brilliant volunteers who are working and have come through the ranks, very often have come from a background that has also had many difficulties in it, and therefore they want to get involved with the youngsters who are at risk or have been involved in crime. But we're not talking about the majority of youngsters. We're saying that all young people are entitled to opportunities and should have those opportunities to expand their horizons, their experiences, their development of values, their relationships. That should be available for everybody, not just those at risk or those who committed a crime. I mentioned that youth centres were set up in the 60s and they were mainly activity run. So young people would go for their activity, and when the activity's finished, they'd leave and go home or go somewhere else. With a youth club, the concentration was on the community, the relationships, and the social activities. That was the big drive. And the activities, I mean, were certainly important, and the teams and things did extremely well, and the art things would be represented in competitions, and very important. But what was behind it was the development of community and the sense of belonging. And that was so strong that, as I say, my friends and also many, many other people who come through Brady are saying that they were lifelong friendships. And with some, they're their closest friends today. And for others, they're just people who will always be there, whether they see them every 5 years, 10 years. They're people they've known from the past, and those friendships are so strong. Community was the driving thing behind the club, whether you were aware of it or not.